Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this live stream. I'm honored to have with me filmmaker, screenwriter, producer, and co-founder of the production company Busca Vida Filmes, Petra Costa. Her 2020 documentary film, The Edge of Democracy, was nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the 92nd Academy Awards and won a Peabody Award. And today we'll be talking about her new Netflix documentary, Apocalypse in the Tropics. Petra, it's great to be with you. I'm just wondering if you can start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into documentary filmmaking in the first place.
Well, first, Reverend Caleb, is that how I pronounced your name?
Caleb, yep.
Caleb. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I came into filmmaking through a long and winding road. I was interested in many things. I started as an actress in theater and then felt I didn't have enough elements to represent the world without knowing more about it. So then I studied anthropology, and anthropology took me to filmmaking, visual anthropology precisely, and I've been doing that since 2008. So almost 20 years now.
Wow, that's incredible. And so you found your way into this. And what was your first film?
My first film is a short film called Undertow Eyes,
Mhm.
which is an investigation into love and aging and
Mm.
death through the life of my grandparents who were together for 70 years. So a kind of love affair that's in extinction right now.
Wow, wow, that's incredible. So I was really moved by Apocalypse in the Tropics because it's terrifying. It's terrifying to see what happened in Brazil. It's terrifying to think about what is happening in the United States as well. And I'm curious, your film shows how Christianity has been used to shape political power in Brazil. But for viewers who are watching this film from the United States and dealing with the rise of Christian nationalism here, I'm curious, what parallels should we be paying attention to between what happened in Brazil and what is happening here in the United States?
Well, that's a question I also have for you,
Hmm.
but because you will know much more about the American context, contemporary context than I do. But what fascinated me in this investigation was I was making at first a film about political crisis in Brazil called The Edge of Democracy that you mentioned. And during the making of that film, I came across many evangelicals in the Brazilian Congress and was amazed by their presence and their strength in the Congress, and wished that someone would make a documentary about that.
Hmm.
Then in 2020, I actually started making that documentary. And once I started to investigate, at first there were a few like liberation theology priests who would say that there was American influence in the rise of evangelicalism in Brazil, but journalists would say that's just a conspiracy theory. There was nothing about American influence on the growth of evangelicalism in Brazil in the press that I could find
Yeah.
almost. And then when I started to investigate, it was very clear. First, once I came across the speeches of Billy Graham, it was like a copy paste of what I had been hearing in the mouth of the pastors here. And I realized soon enough that most of the speeches I was hearing were clearly dominionist speeches,
Hmm.
dominionism being a theology that came from the United States. And then once we started to investigate together with Nicolas Iglesias, who was the investigator of the film, he found that the lobbying group, the family, had sent um, evangelical missionaries to convert congressmen in Brazil under the
Hmm.
guise of teaching them English,
Yeah.
and throughout the country as part of like the Cold War effort to combat communism. and and many of the main pastors continued to have their information in when which we requested via FOIA classified, so we couldn't know much about specific exchanges that have been happening with these pastors, such as Edir Macedo and Malafaia.
Yeah, yeah. So would you say then that kind of this Christian nationalism is then an export of the United
Mhm.
States to Brazil? I think
Clearly.
certainly, yeah, that you see that in the film as you've got these great speeches of Billy Graham, that you're showing, and you contrast that with the work of theologians like Oscar Romero and folks who are liberation theologians who are really developing, I think, a more authentic lived theology there. And so, uh, how is it? Do you have suggestions about how it is that in the United States we kind of come to terms with the fact that we we kind of have caused this problem of Christian nationalism that is kind of going around the world, but also just U.S. interference has really destabilized a lot of democracies in a variety
Mhm.
of ways, and Christian nationalism seems to just be one tool that we have used to destabilize democracies around the world. Do you have suggestions about how it is that people in the United States kind of have a wake up call to our role in all of this?
Yes, I think we're seeing that very clearly with Trump, right?
Yeah,
But Trump is just continuing a trend that has been in the United States since the 50s, 60s, of interfering, of American imperialism, basically,
yeah,
which does not allow for countries to become sovereign and to flourish. Brazil was in a wave of growth in the 50s and 60s were like our golden age. And in 1964, we had a military coup backed by the United States,
yeah.
as well as most countries in Latin America. And that lasted 21 years, and our history was completely halted by that. My parents were in hiding, many of their friends were killed and
Mhm.
tortured. So it's having your country destroyed. And then to come back and stand up again, it takes ages. And then in 2016 we had a parliamentary coup that possibly also had US interference. That's not totally clear, but there are many things that show US interest in our oil company Petrobras, which after that coup was kind of semi-privatized, and and you see it with Iran, you see it with Venezuela, you see it with Ukraine, you see it all over the world, and it's very perverse because it happens in a way that's not fully identifiable as it was with other empires in the past.
Yeah, that's true. It's very covert, and a lot of people don't even seem to know about it. And then it's particularly ironic that the United States goes into place. I mean, let's think specifically about Central and South America and destabilizes democracies there, and then is shocked whenever there are immigration issues, right? Like we're the
Mhm.
cause of those immigration issues, and we need to have a real uh, come to Jesus moment about our role and how all of that has happened. So, Petra, as a pastor, I often say that Christian nationalism is not really about Christianity. It's about nationalism wrapped in Christian language. It's just one of the tools that people are using to manipulate others. From your perspective as a filmmaker, as someone who's done documentaries on this, do you agree with that, that this is more about power than religion? And either way, how do you see that dynamic playing out in Brazil?
Well, the next election will be defined by Christian nationalism in
Yeah.
Brazil. So, Bolsonaro, who was the president of
Right.
Brazil in 2022, went to prison, is currently under house arrest because he had health issues. But he, as Apocalypse in the Tropics showed embraced a Christian nationalist speech, even though he's a Catholic. He's married to a Christian nationalist, assumed and dominionist wife, fervent evangelical, and his son, who will be the candidate who he has anointed as his successor, Flávio Bolsonaro, who will be running elections this year, has embraced a completely dominionist Christian nationalist speech. So he says that his father is a victim of the satanic left, and that they should wage war, a holy war, against this left.
Yeah.
And he uses a lot of Old Testament speech to to call for this holy war.
Yeah.
And that was what happened in the last election. It's what's going to happen again. Unfortunately, as in the United States, we no longer have elections in Brazil since 2018 where you discuss programs, ideas, future. It's they have become holy wars. It's like the army of Christ enveloped in the flag of Christian nationalism against the satanic left. That's what we've been living through. And you see elections become about things as unisex bathrooms,
Yeah.
and satanic candidates. Literally, like in the 2018 election, one of the main fake news that was spread at that time was that the vice candidate was accused of having a satanic baby.
Hmm.
So it's like going back to the Middle Ages. It's very disheartening.
Yeah.
And but I wanted to ask you, like,
Yeah.
how being in the place of the genesis of Christian nationalism in the United States,
Yeah.
how do you see a growing awareness amongst evangelicals about this weaponization of faith that has been happening? Or is that still in the fringes?
It seems like there's a little bit of an awakening. It seems that like fundamentalist evangelicals, this new brand of kind of Christian, I mean, not new brand, but this emerging, rising, growing brand that is like MAGA Christianity, Christian nationalist Christianity, um, has really swept people up. And this is kind of what I was getting at, I think, is I'm not sure that any of these people are actually interested in faith. I'm not sure that they're really particularly interested in following the teachings of Jesus, because the things that they're doing is clearly incompatible with the things that Jesus taught about, say, welcoming the stranger or caring for people in need, ensuring that there's income equality and things like that. These folks don't seem to care about that. So it doesn't seem to me that they're interested in following the teachings of Jesus. It seems more like they are interested in power and manipulation. And it does seem like there is a, a little bit of a maybe a tide turning as people are uh, increasingly frustrated. It seems, Trump's polls or approval ratings are going down, but it's hard because I think that some people have bought in hook, line, and sinker, and I think when we've got churches that are proclaiming Christian nationalism, or this kind of dominion theology, as you were talking about, as if it were gospel, well, that's extremely dangerous. And so I think in the documentary, one of the things that I really saw from Malachias was just kind of this doubling down on this is what Christianity preaches, and saying it loudly, confidently, using whatever media channels are available. And to me, it seemed like, and from watching the film in particular, about it seemed like Bolsonaro is much less interested in Christianity as a confessional tool to make meaning about the world or to live your life in a better way, and much more interested about using Christianity or religion in general as a tool for manipulation to gain power. So I think that's the same as exactly what Trump is not a Christian by any means of the world word. It's funny, whenever he ran, in 2016, he claimed to be a Presbyterian, and the stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church USA wrote a letter saying he's not a Presbyterian by any way that we can define that. He's not a Christian by any way that we can define that. And so I'm curious, Petra, since people often assume that Christianity is, or that Christian nationalism is mostly about theology, but in your film, it feels like we really see it being more about identity, fear, and power. I'm curious, why do you think people are drawn to it? Why is it that, like, everyday average people, even people who have grown up in a religious tradition or whatever, where theoretically they've heard something else, why is it that people are drawn to people like Bolsonaro or like Trump?
Oh, for Bolsonaro, for Trump, Christian nationalism offers them a miracle.
Hmm.
And that miracle is how to get the votes of the people that you will work against their interest, that you will rob them of their rights. How do you convince them to vote for you? Basically saying that if they don't vote for you, it will be a sin, or saying that they must join kind of a holy war, a spiritual war, as they call it, against the satanic left that was working towards giving people better means of life. That happened in Brazil very clearly. I mean, from 2002 to 2011, 12, the minimum salary went from 100 reais to 1,500 reais at a time where it was the reais and the dollar were almost like 2 to 1. So like people had huge increases in like social income and income. And how do you get them to stop voting for the economic interest and vote for something else?
Yeah.
It has proven to be the most seductive thing to say, for them to vote for their moral values. And if they do not vote for the moral values, they will be considered sinners. And that is happening in Brazil. In the last election, the Assembly of God convened 2 days after the first round, because we had elections in 2 rounds this last time, and they summoned all their pastors for this meeting, and basically said that if any of those pastors said anything that would be considered ideologically progressive, ideologically in the left, they would be expelled.
Hmm.
And we show in the film one pastor that was expelled
Wow.
for speaking against Bolsonaro. So we're having religious persecution happening for
Yeah.
political reasons. And yeah, and it's very similar to what happened in during Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, where the religion gives a veil of obedience to a huge part of the population who just has to feels they have to obey this discourse, or else it will be a sin.
Wow, so it sounds like then the real appeal for just average everyday people to vote in this way, to support people in this way, is because they feel like if they don't, then they are being sinful, or maybe that even their eternal souls might be at
Mhm.
risk. And so I'm thinking in the United States too about the ways that people have used particular issues to make people into single issue voters around moral issues. So, for instance, I think a case in point is abortion, where I think fundamentalist conservative churches have said, "Hey, if you support anyone on the left, or if you support anyone other than X Republican candidate, then you're going to be going to hell because you're going to be killing a bunch of babies." That's
Mhm.
kind of the way that they've polarized people in the United States, and so that's very interesting. That it's likely because they feel like their eternal souls are at risk. And
Mhm.
there was, in your documentary, there was this one lady. It was her with her daughter,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
you were asking about who she was going to vote for, and she said, "Well, I think uh, is it De Silva? Lulu? Is that
Lula da
Lulu?
Silva, yeah.
Lula? Yeah, that's he. That he's the better. He's probably the better Christian, or he's got better policies or whatever. But my faith tells me I have to vote for uh, Bolsonaro. And for
Yeah.
me, that was a really interesting moment because even though she didn't think he was going to be the best person for the job, she was
Mhm.
still going to vote for Bolsonaro because she felt like her faith required it. So is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah, that's the kind of thing. And there are many levels of complexities to it, right?
Yeah.
It has to do also with how the the progressives or the left abandoned the working class,
Yeah.
a phenomenon that many have described to have happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Yeah.
and have adopted a more include like a speech about inclusion of women, of gays, of LGBTQ plus into the right, like to give them rights, and how that has been also manipulated by the far right and evangelical, fundamentalist
Yeah.
evangelical Christian nationalists as part of a satanic plan to
Yeah.
subvert families, corrupt children, change the sexes of children, all that speeches that we know, and how, and what was fascinating for me is to see how much of that is linked to Jerry Falwell, like
Yeah.
to the genesis of it is in the founding, in the inauguration of like the moral majority, and
Yeah.
how he decides to use abortion as this way of uniting Catholics and evangelicals, and become a political force.
Yeah. I mean, fascinating, right? Because Falwell, by his own admission, didn't preach on abortion for years, and after Roe v. Wade, it wasn't until it was found to be a political force, a way to galvanize voters, that became that became something he even cared about. And so I think that's also interesting. I think the move from the left away from working class, or the perceived move from the left away from working class, even though policies of the left tend to benefit people who are of lower economic status. And I think about how the United States, the Democratic Party is often perceived as having left behind working class folks, especially in the South of the U.S., that had turned a once loyal Democratic base into very conservative uh, Republican voters because of kind of the perceived uh, a left elitism, even though those policies tend to benefit people who are of lower economic status. So, we've talked a bit about this, but Americans, I think, especially as they're watching your documentary, Petra, have noticed real similarities between Bolsonaro and Trump. Amazing, I know. But in your reporting and filmmaking, what similarities and differences did you see in how religion was being used between in Brazil and in the United States?
Well, it's similar in so many ways.
Yeah.
Like this idea that they're both kind of representing, or like a David figure or other figures, biblical figures of similar stature, in the sense that they're not perfect Christians, but they're
Mm.
carrying forward a Christian mission, and that they're sinful, but that should be forgiven given the what they're working for,
Yeah.
um, is very present. And then the fact that Bolsonaro was stabbed right in 2018, and after that, many evangelical leaders came out saying that that was a proof that he was the Messiah, that he had
Yeah.
survived, and therefore had to save the Brazilian nation. And then to see Trump saying the exact same words
Yeah.
in
After the
20,
year. Yeah.
what was it, 2023, his election,
Uh,
um,
yeah,
or
yeah, running up to
2024.
2024. Yeah.
yeah, 2024. Yeah, so that 6 years later, Trump adopts the exact same speech after
Yeah.
he's shot. And
Maybe even the same strategy, right?
yeah,
Uh,
exactly. And
oh, my ear is
um,
healed. It's fine.
yeah, yeah, and and kind of this guy's where it's like as long as he's being blessed by pastors
Yeah.
and that they're saying that he's kind of divinely anointed, whatever he does doesn't really, there's no sin. There's
Yeah.
no possible sin possible. Like he's shielded, you know. Um but I'm curious, like James Tallarico has been very
Yeah.
um like outspoken in his critique of Christian nationalism. Do you see that going further into, like, do you see that having an effect in the public sphere, in the religious sphere in the US?
I mean, he's great, and the fact that he's in Texas is amazing, and a seminarian. So I think it makes a difference when people are authentically speaking about who Jesus actually was. Yeah, I think that whenever people who are actually interested in the message of the historical Jesus, the things that he actually taught, not the things that churches have kind of made up or the ways that churches have used Jesus to consolidate power, yeah, be that political power or even powers within their institutions. Whenever they're actually interested in what Jesus taught about standing on behalf of the marginalized and creating a better world. That I think that makes a big difference when people use whatever platforms they have to do that. And so I think one of the reasons that he is so popular is that people see him as authentic.
Mhm.
I think that's really what we long for as human beings anyway, is we want authenticity. And one of the biggest problems that faith traditions have, and I think certainly that Christianity has, is that people hear one thing on Sunday morning, like you go and you read from the gospel, and Jesus is talking about how people shouldn't be poor, right? And then you go and you vote in a way or you act in a way that directly contradicts what Jesus taught. So I think when politicians like Tallarico or like Raphael Warnock or other folks who have kind of a faith background and are talking about why their faith influences them, and it's something that's clearly authentic, I think that makes a difference. Because I think whenever we've got evangelical leaders who are talking about how it's primarily about belief and you can do no wrong, and all of that stuff, people recognize that that's not authentic. And I think that's one of the reasons people don't want anything to do with religion, is that we've got an authenticity problem, because well,
Yeah.
folks are not really living out authentic lives, from my perspective.
Yeah, and you had in the United States Martin Luther King and
Mm,
other figures,
yeah.
religious figures that really changed the history of the country. Do you see something like that happening again? Like, or and how long do you think it will take? You know,
Yeah.
for for their for leaders that have a religious speech, but that really care about human beings, and a kind of more pure Christian message rather than this Christian nationalist message. Right now, what would you say is the balance? Is Christian nationalism there and like progressive Christianity here, or like how tilted is here in Brazil? It's like this right now, like almost
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
say 80 or 90% of evangelical leaders of importance are aligned, still aligned with the far right.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to say, right? When you look at the exit polls from the last election, you can see that a lot of denominations really split the vote between who they voted for. And so I think that's representative of just how the United States is right now. It's a
Mhm.
deeply divided country. I think the places where I find hope in the midst of that is that as we look at places all around the nation where we're seeing protests, where we're seeing people out in the street, that clergy are there and they're saying, "Hey, those who have had the loudest voices for the past 40, 50 years don't represent most of us, don't
Mm-hmm.
represent who we think we ought to be." And so I think clergy have been active in that, and that's helpful. But I mean, we also have a lot of clergy who continue to prop up Trump,
Mm-hmm.
and continue to be a part of that power structure. So I don't know. I find hope in the fact that the American people, it seems like, are beginning to recognize the danger of Christian nationalism and nationalism, or voting for people who are clearly interested in fascism. That I think that we as a people, even people who voted for Trump
Mm-hmm.
in this last election, are beginning to see that maybe the things that he promised are not the things that he's going to do. Right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Gas prices are going to lower. They're the highest they've ever been. Right? They're almost $7 by my house. The or there's not gonna be any new wars. Well, Venezuela, Iran, right? I think people
Mm-hmm.
are sometimes seeing the hypocrisy. One thing that I think is interesting, Petra, and I don't know how you think about this, but we've got all these studies that show us year after year that fewer people are interested in organized religion, but people still kind of are seem to be interested in spirituality, or are, even if they identify as nothing in particular, are interested in seem to be
Mm-hmm.
interested in some sort of spirituality. And so it seems to me that the broader kind of cultural shift that we're seeing is also just away from organized religion. And so I think that's another thing that makes
Yeah.
it tough to say, like, how do people feel about this? Well, I'm not sure we're putting ourselves in such neat categories as we used to. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of people who might generally identify with the Christian tradition who,
Mm-hmm.
think that Trump is full of crap. And I think that's that people being vocal about that and calling out hypocrisy, it, especially hypocrisy within Christianity, is
Mm-hmm.
important. Is real
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. Totally.
Were there things that you learned as you were doing this documentary that surprised you, that you didn't know? You talk about kind of being an outsider to the faith and learning a lot about Christianity, a lot about
Mm-hmm.
Christian nationalism, obviously in
Mm-hmm.
the midst of all this. Were there things that just kind of took you by surprise as you were doing the documentary?
Well, I thought that religion was a thing of the past
Yeah.
until a few years ago, and I was clearly mistaken. I think religion is the wave of the future. In Even though you have like the number of people, as you said, that are affiliated with with organized religion diminishing, the number of fervent religious people is augmenting, and the alignment between religion and politics is also augmenting. Um, in in with the rise of fundamentalism, so
Yeah.
we're seeing what was already a phenomenon in many Arab countries, right? Like Islamic fundamentalism happening with Jewish fundamentalism and with Christian fundamentalism in a very rapid pace in the last 10 years,
Mm. Mm.
um, where 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 these religious fundamentalisms are being embraced by the presidents and shaping geopolitics.
Yeah.
Like many of the current wars and future wars will be defended under that guise, right? As they were in the past with the Crusades and and with all that. But it was something that I didn't imagine that we would be
Mm.
living in 2025, religious wars. And
Yeah.
as I said, elections becoming not about political programs, but about religion. So that was a huge discovery, and how much of it is justified through religious texts. I mean, how much of how many US senators are citing the Bible for their votes as our Brazilian senators and congressmen, out of demagogy or true belief. And
That was
uh,
That was interesting. I mean, you commented on that in the film too, and I'm not sure if it was at the trying to remember if it was as you were as showing like the in the art gallery or whatever, but about how it seemed like we were moving away from theocracies and forming secular democracies, right?
mhm,
And then it seems like now we're kind of overthrowing our democracies
mhm,
to reestablish theocratic states, and
exactly.
that's terrifying. I
Yeah.
because I think it was also kind of generally agreed upon by a lot of us that that was a good move, right?
Mhm.
That it was a
Even
good move.
even by Christians, I mean, mostly by
Right.
Christians.
Right. I mean, you think about I think you think about the folks who the founders, the founding fathers of the United States, right? That most of them believed in something. You know, a lot of them were deists, and but believed in, but also believed that it was okay for people to have different beliefs, or no beliefs, right? And so
Mhm,
that is kind of what we're supposed to be built on in the United States,
mhm,
and we have lost all of that. It's kind of a my way or the highway. Agree with me 100%, or
mhm,
else we can't agree about anything.
mhm,
Have you noticed that shift in the culture in Brazil too? Like outside of politics, is there kind of a you either agree with me on everything or nothing? Do you all still have the ability to have conversations in Brazil? Because it feels like in the United States, we've kind of lost the ability to disagree
mhm,
about anything or to have
mhm.
conversations about anything because of the way that all of this has played out. What's it like in Brazil?
Well, I feel that was also exported from the US to Brazil because
Mm,
I remember it clearly when I studied in the United States. I did my undergraduate there in the years 2000s, so like 2002 to 6, more or less.
yeah.
And one of the main things that I saw as a difference was how polarized the United States was racially, politically,
Yeah.
and how mixed Brazil was, for better or for worse. You
Mm,
know, I mean that I think really made Brazil much slower than the U.S. and like civil rights, on affirmative action, on many policies that brought many more blacks in the United States to positions of power than it did in Brazil. Brazil, 51% of the population is black, and you see much less black people in positions of power and
mm,
with much lower income until today. And that is also a consequence of how Brazil was never very clear and never really polarized about its racial policies. And the same goes for everything, like uh, there weren't these wars between evangelicals and Catholics, between left and right. Like there was even a shame in considering yourself after the Brazilian dictatorship, and no one would say they were from the right
mm,
after the dictatorship. Like everyone would consider themselves center at most. And then there was this exportation of far right speech from the United States to Brazil very clearly, that happened in a very fast speed in 2013, accelerated by social media. And suddenly, from one day to the other, you have a movement, a
mm.
far right movement in Brazil that really changed the way people interacted, uh, in a very deep way, and makes it more and more impossible for dialogue to exist,
Wow.
because
I mean,
it is a movement of intolerance, of deep intolerance towards the other. And of course that intolerance also exists in what you call the woke movement, which was also exported from the United States to Brazil. The way all consciousness about women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and everything, and like politically correct speech is necessary. Some people say, yeah, they're two sides of the same coin. I would say that's an exaggeration, but there's a degree to which it's, if you have both sides saying whatever you do is a crime, whatever you do is satanic, then it's impossible to have a conversation.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point, too. I mean, as someone on the left, that it can be one of the things that I think we tend to do is like we all have to agree on absolutely everything,
Hmm.
or there's kind of a checklist of things that you all have to agree with to be able to work together. And the right really doesn't do that in the same way.
Hmm.
Like can be like, okay, we're uh, vote for this candidate because of abortion, period, right? Like that's it, or because of trans folks in bathrooms or whatever. But I think on the left we tend to be like, okay, well, do you support this, and this, and this? And if you
And
do, then maybe
the
we can
right
work
is
together.
and the right is much more forgiving, right? In the sense that, like, you have the
Absolutely.
right, you have the far right embrace people like Naomi Wolf, who was a
Yeah.
feminist. I don't know what she
Yeah.
calls herself now, and many other people like that, who were kind of discredited by the progressives, and that are embraced by the far right, no matter what is their political background. And the progressives are much more criterious about who they allow into their club, let's say.
Well, I think that's right, and I think the point about being forgiving is another piece of that, as you mentioned that, like, okay, well, not only do you have to agree with us now, but what's your track record on all of this,
Mhm.
and can we agree? And I think in order to make progress, back to your earlier point, I think that in order to make progress, we do have to have some willingness to work together, even if we don't agree
Mhm.
on everything, to work together on what we can work together on, and
And
that
I think,
feels important.
yeah, and I think Mamdani and Lula for me seem
Mhm.
like figures that are much more malleable in the
Yeah,
progressive side.
yeah,
And I mean, as people say, Mamdani's smile seemed all inclusive and inviting
yeah,
in a way that is very refreshing for politics. Lula has a similar track record, and his last election, he did something amazing where he really aligned, which is kind of he. I don't know if he had read the book, but did you read the book How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky?
yes, yeah,
It's a great book. Yeah,
yeah,
you
yeah,
have.
yeah, yes,
So Lula did everything that
yeah,
Stephen Levitsky recommends in that book in
uh-huh,
terms of allying with people that were on the right, political adversaries,
yeah,
lifetime adversaries, to combat the far right,
yeah,
and that kind of attitude is crucial.
yeah, right, because that's the only way that you do any kind of real coalition building, to make progress, and so I'm hopeful then that that makes a difference in Brazil. What do you think the next election is going to look like?
I think it's gonna be, as I said again, a holy war.
Yeah,
Um, Unfortunately, the two candidates are kind of tied in the polls
yeah,
right now.
yeah,
So Flávio Bolsonaro, who had never run for president just
yeah,
because he's carrying his father's name and his
yeah,
blessing, is already very high in the polls, and the economic elite in Brazil and part of a consistent part of the media has already embraced him,
yeah,
because what is happening, what you see in the films that portray
yeah,
Nazi Germany, like the bourgeoisie, like the dominant class is very friendly with fascism, unfortunately,
mhm,
and finds it less dangerous than progressive politics, than taxing. Basically, they're aversive to
yeah,
being taxed,
yeah,
and uh, since ancient Greece, that's the reason democracy has always been toppled, again, because the rich don't want to pay taxes, and and they have found that allying themselves with fundamentalist religious candidates or leaders is the best way to not pay taxes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and certainly the parallel in the U.S. too, right? I think that's a lot of what's it always about? It's about money and power, right? It's
Yeah.
always about money and power. Where does the money and power reside? So, in terms of money and power, and people trying to hold on to that, uh, I think a lot of people have drawn a parallel, and we see this in the film as well, between January 6th and January 8th, and the storming of the Capitol in both places. And so it's kind of interesting that one that we exported Christian nationalism to Brazil, but we also can learn something about the Christian nationalism from Brazil. So, what lessons should the U.S. be learning from what happened in Brazil and what almost happened? Right, the coup that the kind of the storming of the Capitol, but then also the coup that really almost happened to Brazil. What lessons should we be learning here to try and prevent the same kind of thing?
I think the main lesson is we had the same coup attempts, right? And ours
Yeah.
was a bit
Right.
more serious
Yeah.
because it was proven by the federal police that not just
Yeah.
did he want not to take over the government, but kill Lula, his vice president, and Supreme Court Justice
Yeah.
Alexandre de Moraes. Um, but but he has been held accountable for that. Bolsonaro and top generals that were involved in
Yeah.
the coup attempt were judged and condemned and imprisoned.
Yeah.
Bolsonaro was condemned to 27 years in prison. Something that could happen and should have happened to Trump, like according to Stephen Levitsky again, like
Mhm.
Trump should have been held accountable and could have been
Yeah.
held accountable. Uh, and if the Biden administration had been more forceful and the prosecutors and lawyers, etc., that were going after him, and it was too slow or too unforceful. Um, Unfortunately, the justice minister that condemned Bolsonaro to prison is now under scrutiny himself for another scandal of receiving money from a banker. So so that process has been a bit stained by that,
Mm.
which is quite unfortunate because he was giving an example not just to the United States but to the whole world of how to combat this far right fever. Many uh, people who study democracy worldwide have been saying that the Brazil was the first country to institutionally combat this new wave of far right fever
Yeah.
in an effective way. And and even with the stain, I think it's still different things, and it has to
Yeah.
be taken as an inspiration.
Yeah. So Petra, given all of that and everything that we've talked about today, where do you find hope in the midst of all of this?
Well, I find hope in this and in this institutional enforcement of
Hmm.
accountability, which has to happen in many instances. Most grave being what is happening in Palestine until today, like
Yeah.
uh, Biden, Trump, Netanyahu, especially have to be held accountable
Yeah.
for this genocide.
Yeah.
And I find hope in the appearance of new political figures such
Mhm.
as Mamdani, and who managed to reinvigorate a speech about how important it is to 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 redistribute wealth. You know that
Mhm.
it's what Jesus was preaching about, and it's what all these wars are ultimately about. But how do we re-signify these speeches? Right now, I feel the far right has much more ability to convince and compel people through their speeches. And when figures appear that know how to use social media and know how to make people passionate again about about fighting for social justice. It's very inspiring. So I hope more figures like him appear.
Yeah, yeah, and have the courage to stand up, in a real, authentic way. I think that is hopeful. I find hope in that too, and the hope that I've always been kind of an optimistic person, and hoping that, like, we are making some kind of progress as a society, that we're moving towards greater equality, and I hope
Mhm.
that that's something that we can see. But I find hope in people protesting too, in people saying, "Hey, whenever rights are being stripped away, whenever we see the rise of Christian nationalism, whenever we see leaders who aren't being held accountable, people going to the streets and demanding accountability, I find hope in that."
And
So,
I find a lot of hope in religious figures like yourself who are reclaiming Christianity. I think it's one of the most crucial things in our both our countries in these days.
well, I hope that more religious figures are willing to say, "Hey, look, if we're going to follow Jesus, that means actually following Jesus, right?" So
Yeah.
that means calling out hypocrisy, and that means living authentically to the teachings that Jesus called us. And I find hope too in you, Petra, and
Mhm.
bringing to light the ways that power is being manipulated, that money is being manipulated, and that people are manipulating religion as well to serve themselves. So if people want to learn more about this, and they want to watch this documentary and your other work, and find out more about you and what's coming up next, where can they do all of that?
Well, both Apocalypse and the Tropics and The Edge of Democracy and my first feature film, Elena, are all on Netflix. So please visit Netflix to watch them.
That's great. And do you have projects coming up, or anything you're excited about right now?
Um, yes. Well, I have a project which I can't talk much about
Okay.
besides the fact
Yes.
that it's a Western. But if you follow me on Instagram, I'll be updating. My name is Petra Costa on Instagram with an L at the end. And as soon as I can share information, I will.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Petra. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for being an inspiration. Thank you for this film, Apocalypse in the Tropics, and thank you for helping to raise awareness about Christian nationalism. It's good to be with you today, and wish you the best as you're moving on to the next project as well. Thank you,
Thank
Petra.
you. Thank you.
Good
Great
good to spend
pleasure
time with you.
speaking to you. Likewise.